have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka. Hey everybody, Jim and I are glad you're here. We've got another installment of the JFK. Are we going to call this Assassination? How do we want to refer to it now? The JFK saga. How about that?
Yeah, it is about the assassination.
It
and
is.
What actually happened, whether or not there was or was not a conspiracy.
Yep. And a recent hearing. So we're here today because of this hearing that took place. May 20th, Representative Ana Luna of Florida has decided to take the lid off of all of the JFK documentation, invite people who are still alive to come and testify, and hopefully shed a little bit more light on what people like Jim, for example, have known all along because they've been doing the research. So my job here today is to keep Jim in the corral as much as possible. Your job, as you're listening to this, is to take away from that more than 3 hours worth of hearing key points that, if they interest you, you ought to really know. So let me set this up. May 20th, 2025, the second iteration, I believe, of this hearing. The panel was convened with witnesses. It took 3 hours, but we're going to break that down and really boil it down to 2 points. By saving you time, we're going to grab the most important aspects of that hearing and bring them into the room for your consideration. And then we're going to offer some missing context, because these things have been, I know it's been many years since anything went down in real life, but to have that context will let you make sense of what we share with you and what came out of the hearing. And hopefully you'll be able to take away from that a clearer idea of what actually happened to President Kennedy.
Yeah, I want it to be, if you're not up to speed on this, it's hard to understand why some of these points were important. And so I'm just going to give you the highlights, but I'm not going to give you the highlights without the context. I think that's really important to understand. We're going to make 4 points, and I'm hopeful we can do all 4 points in an episode, but we don't know in advance whether or not, depending on how this discussion goes, whether there's going to be 1 or 2 episodes. I'm just going to, there's the dirty secret here. Jim is bad at estimating how long things take, and he tends to over prepare. That guy they should not take away his show, I guess. Anyway, I want to say,
we're going to keep you around.
I want to say one more thing though. I want to add, and that is that the thing that's most fascinating to me about these hearings, the singular thing that's most fascinating, conceptually speaking, not the details, conceptually speaking, is that human beings seem to have a perverted need for things to be made official. And by official, they mean the state has ruled on them.
Right.
So there's almost like a permission slip that people feel that they have to have. Well, we're never going to figure this case out. You'll hear people say this all the time. I have these conversations, and I know most of the time they're telling me to shut up. They don't want me to talk about this issue. They just wanted a simple answer to their question. They don't really want an explanation. Because if you're really interested, I'll feed you with a fire hose. And I've done it. I've had a couple of people that have been like, oh, that was amazing. But I've also had a couple of people like, oh, we're never going to figure this out. And that means they want me to shut up. Okay, I get that. But on the other part of this is most people will not give themselves permission to land on any kind of concept or idea on this because it hasn't been sent down from on high, and on high ends up meaning the state.
Well, let's ask about the on high. Do we have all the records now, finally, at last?
No, and we're going to cover that. We're going to cover that right off the bat here. First, District Judge John Tunheim was the chair. Is a U.S. federal district judge. Was the chair of the Assassination Records Review Board, which was working for just a handful of years, just under 4 years in the 1990s, as a result of Oliver Stone's movie JFK. Congress unanimously, including then Senator Joe Biden, voted to get all the records out as quickly as possible, and none later than October of 2017. Tunheim was the chair of that board. He's the only living member of the board. There still might be some employees of the board. One of them was at this hearing. We'll get to him in a second. But he's the only living member of the board that was appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate to do this work that only lasted for a little more than 3 years. He said that the FBI is now seeing many records that were hidden from the Assassination Records Review Board. And I got to give the Trump administration credit for this. They literally did reveal more records. They found right before they did the release, they said, "Oh, we got thousands more pages. We're going to add to the batch." The CIA was not particularly cooperative. And he gave a specific example of James Angleton, who we will not delve into today. You can wiki him. But he had the Oswald file on his desk. When we talked about this in the last episode that I did about the subject, where, by the way, that episode, I've changed my mind about a lot of things. That we have gotten a lot of information, and a lot of the things that we sought in that report have come out. We do have a good chunk of them, not all of them. I'm going to give you the greatest example of the missing thing in a moment. But the Oswald file was on James Angleton's desks until about just a couple of weeks before the assassination. And it had been there for years. And everything was on Oswald was being routed to him, which is incredibly significant. And those records, Tunheim and his team were told in the 1990s, quote, were no longer stored as a collection, end quote, meaning that they couldn't assemble conveniently. They could not assemble that information for him. Yes, they dispersed it. We dispersed it to the winds.
Yep.
Maybe to some shredders. Who knows? Anyway.
And we wouldn't want to suggest that the government shredded any of this evidence, would we, Jim?
Yes, but the record stuff doesn't stop with the government. Two little known things. First, there are Belarus records on Oswald. Oswald was living in Belarus, Russia. He was living in the Soviet Union for a couple of years. And while he was there, the KGB was keeping assiduous records on him. And we are told that Tunheim told the commission that the file is 5 foot tall. That's how many records they have.
The KGB file?
The KGB file on Oswald, the Belarusian records are 5 feet tall. And so we don't have those. And there's a negotiation that could occur diplomatically now to obtain those records. And this committee wants to, this task force, it's not even a full committee. They should push for this. Tunheim is saying these are valuable records that would help historians and researchers. And so we should be pushing to get those. Apparently, we were very close to having them.
If Representative Luna says, as chairman of the House Task Force on the, what is it called, declassification of federal secrets, she can go to her counterpart or something at the Kremlin and say, we're doing this project.
No, the State Department needs to do that.
The State Department needs to do it. Okay, so
needs to do that.
That gets funneled through
it was
the same funnel that everybody else is using.
The Assassination Records Review Board had that power they had vast powers during the 1990s, the brief time they were opening.
Yeah.
And they were very close in their negotiations, but the clock ran out on them. And they weren't refunded or, they didn't get an allocation and they were closed down, unfortunately.
So the Russian records didn't become part of the consideration.
Right. But this is something that our government could work to obtain. It wouldn't be very difficult to get at this point. It should be part of diplomatic negotiations. Then there is the biography, The Death of a President. William Manchester wrote a Kennedy family authorized biography, but when the Kennedy family saw what was in it, they sued him. So he wrote a book called The Making of a President. They were like, well, that was pretty friendly to us. So now we're going to give him an opportunity to write Death of a President. Oh, wait a minute. There's a chapter in there about his discussion that involves a discussion that Manchester had with Jackie Kennedy. No one knows for sure what is in that chapter. I am not going to share the speculation I've heard today. If you know me personally and you want to ask, fine, but I'm going to leave you hanging on that one because honestly, we don't know what's in it, and that's the issue. And there were a series of tapes that he recorded. Both of these have been disappeared into the Kennedy library system. Jackie did not reveal them. Robert and Jackie sued. Then Robert Kennedy Sr. sued and stopped it from being released. And Caroline Kennedy had the opportunity and was asked by the Assassination Records Review Board to release those because her mother had passed away and it was now her call, and she has refused to do so. And I don't think we should have any expectation that this is going to change because the Kennedy family is a Democratic Party corporation. They care immensely about the survival of the Democratic Party. And Caroline's son, who would ostensibly be her heir on this question, is very opposed to all of this discussion. He just wants it all to end. And frankly, the Kennedy family wants both assassination discussions to largely be over because it gets in the way of business. I'm just harshly speaking, it's the truth. It gets in the way of the thing that they care about the most, which is the Democratic Party. So another person who was there was Doug Horne. He was a staff member of the Assassination Records Review Board who has since written several books. And he provided a list of 8 missing autopsy photos and X-rays. He also revealed that Navy one of the forensic pathologists doing the autopsy, a Navy admiral by the name of Humes, or Navy officer by the name of Humes, told an Army officer who was there in the same capacity that when he arrived on the scene, his name was Fink, that no sawing of the skull was necessary to remove the brain. So he revealed all of this. The clip actually takes about 6, almost 7 minutes to tell. Otherwise, I'd play it for you. But what is missing is really significant in terms of how we understand the autopsy, and it is missing. And so that was something that was discussed in there. But here's the most important thing. The ghost of George Joannides was present. George Joannides, the chair of the task force, Representative Anna Luna, updated everyone about his file specifically right from the beginning of the hearing. He came up on 2 separate occasions, one of which we will really feature here for you. He plays a very significant and not understood by most people who've like watched JFK or some other documentary. This is something most people don't know that turns out to be extremely significant in the history of understanding this case. So it's George Joannides.
So we want to get into that, like the 4 major pillars of this. Do we have all the records? Check. We've just covered that. So this is part 2 now. What about George?
Yeah.
What about George?
What about George? Okay, this is going to take quite a bit of time in our discussion today because I have to set significant context for you so you understand. This is major stuff and it has a lot of layers. Okay. So the very first story I want to tell you is out of New Orleans. Oswald, in the summer, mostly August of 1963, is in New Orleans working for something called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, pretending to be an officer of that committee, standing out on the streets handing pamphlets. A group of Cuban patriots, anti-Castro Cuban patriots, students, end up having a fight with him on the street. They're all arrested. They all agree to the other ones are let go. They all basically agree with the to cooperate and pay the judge. But Oswald wants a trial. He insists that there be a hearing on his thing, and he ends up getting fined. And then he's brought on to do a radio interview with one of the members of the DRE. So he goes on and debates the Cuban situation and the meaning of Marxism with this member of this student group based mostly out of Florida called the DRE, but they extended all across the southern part of the United States. So if you think about it, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was a real thing that existed up in New York. It wasn't something that really existed south of the Mason-Dixon line. But all of a sudden, a guy shows up in the Deep South and says, hey, I'm handing out pamphlets in a place where this is going to be really well accepted. And I'm being extremely sarcastic right now. And gets in a fight, of course. And it's a very public fight, and it makes the newspapers, and it leads to a hearing, which then subsequently leads to a radio appearance. And all of this is going to be very, very important on November 23rd, the day after the assassination. This information is going to flood into the media, leaving everyone with the impression that perhaps, or even likely, Castro and the Cuban government was behind the plot, and
That's
that would
where it
mean
came from.
ostensibly the allies of them, which are the Soviet Union, may also be behind the plot.
Yeah.
So this is going to be really, really significant to that. So don't forget that this has happened. Now, why am I telling you this story since you just asked me about George Joannides? Why am I telling you this, Bill? Because George Joannides, well, he shows up again in 1977 and 8 and 9. And he's working with the Stokes Committee. The proper name of it is the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations, or the House Assassinations Committee. And he becomes the CIA liaison officer. And it wouldn't really matter terribly. I mean, it would be an anecdote about how uncooperative the CIA was, except he chose not to disclose his role in these events that I just described. So the DRE was getting, and this can keep in mind, this is 1963, they were getting $51,000. I believe it was a month Please double check me on that. From the CIA in grant funds to run their organization. And the liaison officer for that, the guy that was their kind of coach or captain or advisor, was none other than George Joannides.
George again. Yeah.
And George didn't reveal this to the committee. He didn't tell them. He kept this a secret. They would have deposed him. They would have called him as a witness, but his role in this was kept top secret, confidential, and no one on the committee knew this. So
How
Robert
could you
Blake,
not? I mean,
because he was hiding it. He was
Okay.
literally refusing. He had answered questions that would leave them with the impression he had no role in this affair whatsoever.
got it. So he was actively covering it up. Covering
Yeah,
up
this is a fox guarding the hen house situation.
Mhm.
So I believe you have there. First, I'm going to just describe Robert Blakey was the second counsel in charge. There were two counsels. The first one was Mr. Sprague. Robert Blakey was the second one. He's a very significant legal. He plays a very significant role in American legal history. He's basically the guy that gave us the RICO Act. But in this particular case, he's a congressional staffer who ends up being the lead counsel for the House Assassinations Committee. And this George Joannides dies in the early 1990s. This fact ends up coming out. It's revealed as a result of the Assassination Records Review Board. And Robert Blakey went to PBS Frontline and said this.
This is crazy good stuff. Okay, I quote, "I now no longer believe anything the agency told the committee any further than I can obtain substantial corroboration for it from outside the agency for its veracity." And the agency is the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, and he's basically saying they deserve the penalty of the doubt.
They do, yes. So continuing, "We now know that the agency withheld from the Warren Commission the CIA mafia plots to kill Castro. Had the commission known of the plots, it would have followed a different path in its investigation. The agency unilaterally deprived the commission of a chance to obtain the full truth, which will now never be known." Significantly, the Warren Commission's conclusion that the agencies of the government cooperated with it is, in retrospect, not the truth. We also now know that the agency set up a process that could only have been designed to frustrate the ability of the committee in 1976 to 79 to obtain any information that might adversely affect the agency. Many have told me that the culture of the agency is one of prevarication and dissimulation, and that you cannot trust it or its people. Period. End of story. I am now in that camp.
I just want to say how significant this is. People that work in the government don't talk this way. They don't talk this way.
Yep.
They're always giving the benefit of the doubt to everyone involved because most of the time you can describe things as incompetence or incomplete or unaware or whatever. So they're always trying to find the benefit of the doubt for their colleagues. And here is a guy that's been in the system saying, my gosh, an entire agency deserves the penalty of the doubt. So now I want to go to Mexico City. I just want to hop there. I want you to put a pin in your brain. I want you to keep in mind the New Orleans DRE situation that was undisclosed. I want you to keep in mind that George Joannides is now working as the liaison between a committee that's investigating the assassination and the CIA, who ostensibly is supposed to help deliver records to them. You're going to hear how well he helped before we're done. But the records that are going to be discussed involved one of the people who testified. And I think this is one of the biggest things that was revealed in these hearings. And it's something that should have made headline news. So it is the story of Oswald in Mexico City. So in late September 1963, there is a debate that goes on in the research community about whether or not Oswald made a trip to Mexico City to obtain a Cuban and Soviet visa. That he wanted to fly from Mexico to Cuba and then perhaps on to the Soviet Union. The Warren Commission concludes that's exactly what he was there to do, but they treat him like a lone nut on this trip, as they do throughout everything. I will not be able to give you all the details. What I'm going to give you is such a quick sketch of what happened and a couple of questions I have about it and things that you should see or be aware of. Because I can't. One podcast I listened to has devoted 9 episodes to the subject I'm about to cover in just a few minutes here. So if you want more information, there's plenty out there, and this is definitely a rich field to get into. it definitely made an impact on Representative Eric Burleson, who was one of the questioners on Luna's panel on the 20th. But Dan Hardway was there to speak to the panel. He was one of the witnesses. Now, his significance in this story is that he is the co-author of what has come to be known as the Lopez Report. It's officially titled Oswald, the CIA in Mexico City. And this report was prepared in 1978 by Edwin Lopez and the aforementioned Dan Hardway for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. It investigates Oswald's activities in his travel during this trip to Mexico City in September of '63. And it was for a very long time classified. But we began to see it as soon as the ARB got together as they're in a much more complete form, starting in 1993. And then there were redactions that were gradually removed on up into the early part of this century. There are some points I want to make, 4 in particular. First, Oswald's interactions with the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City. He went in and out of those embassies more than once and met with the people in there. And he was apparently very temperamental while he was there, so that he definitely made a mark on the people that he was talking to. The report, the Lopez report, scrutinizes these attempts to secure these transit visas. That's one of the things it does. Second, this is where it begins to get interesting. It begins to note CIA surveillance failures. So it highlights that the CIA Mexico City station, had an extensive surveillance operation targeting the Cuban and Soviet embassies. This included photographic and audio monitoring. In other words, they were photographing the doors and they were listening to the phone conversations in and out of the building. Now, the recordings, conveniently, Bill, were erased. They had said, well, that happened all the way back in September, and we reuse these tapes every so many days, and we've just completely lost all of the recorded proof that he was actually on there. They had another major gap in their surveillance records. Now, this is 1963. This is a weird thing for me to tell you, but they had already developed the technology where they could use motion to activate a separate machine that would drop a hammer on the top of the photograph. You know how cameras used to have the button on the side? Side? You hold it like this and then you'd press the button. Well, they'd figured out a way to, every time they wanted to do something motion in front of the door, it would just tap, because they didn't want it to land and take a lot of pictures. It was film, right? Which is in limited supply. So they wanted it to drop a hammer, right?
This is 1960s technology.
This was 1960s technology, and it wasn't something anybody else was doing. This was something the government did. And they had rigged this up, and they even tested it the day before Oswald was alleged to have gone into these embassies. But magically, they had no actual photos from these entrances. None. They didn't have them for the humans that were sitting in directly across the street from it, and on the side doors where they had this hammer process working. They didn't have those photos either. It's just a miracle that they didn't have those photos. Well, we're going to show you in a moment. They actually did have at least one photo, but we'll show that to you momentarily. Let me get on to number 3. There was evidence of impersonation. This is in the Lopez report. They note evidence that Oswald himself is being impersonated. They had acquired one audio recording and noticed voice discrepancies, and they had also come up with a picture. And they were implying that Oswald was connected in all of this somehow with Soviet intelligence. I want first, let's put up that graphic. Let's show them the November 23rd picture of Oswald. Let's let the audience see this. Okay, so in the middle is a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. And the picture that I'm showing to you is taken while he's being interviewed by a TV reporter during the aforementioned New Orleans saga. So now you got a good visual of what Lee Harvey Oswald looks like. He's slender, he's kind of short. He does have a slightly receding hairline, but he's still a guy in his 20s. Now I want you to look at the 2 pictures flanking him. These are the 2 photos that the CIA supplied and said that they were Lee Harvey Oswald. This guy is bigger, stockier, older, has a bald spot, and a more receding hairline. His nose is wider. Does he look to you anything like Lee Harvey Oswald?
Couldn't be.
So on the morning of November 23rd, 1963, I just want to put emphasis on this. The President of the United States is assassinated at 12:30, November 22nd, 1963. The world hears at 1 p.m., the famous Walter Cronkite removes his lenses moment, where he announces that the president is now dead, happens at 1 o'clock Central Time, okay? The next day in the morning, it's still a.m., FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover calls the new president, Lyndon Johnson, and says there's a problem. This call was at 10:01 a.m., so it's less than it's since it's Eastern time, it is 22 hours since the declaration of death.
Yeah.
He reported that the recordings made in the Soviet embassy in Mexico City of Oswald did not match the voice of Oswald. And then he stated the following thing, Bill.
Yes. Here's the quote. We have up here the tape and the photograph of the man at the Soviet embassy using Oswald's name. That picture and the tape do not correspond to this man's voice nor to his appearance. In other words, it appears that there's a second person who was at the Soviet embassy down there in Mexico. End quote.
So, what a lot of people don't understand about these government agencies, especially back in this era, since 9/11, this may not be as true as it was. There was this stovepipe type approach. Everybody had kind of their own silo of information. CIA people talked with and trusted only CIA people. FBI people trusted and only talked with FBI people. Over in Treasury, where the Secret Service lived, they only talked with the people in the Treasury Department. There were these silos, and they weren't really well coordinated in talking, and they certainly didn't trust one another. This siloing and this thing also at the time was severe distrust. Hoover did not trust the CIA. The CIA didn't trust anybody. And so he's telling the president, we've got a problem. Now, they've already begun to make the decision after the arrest of Oswald that they are going to do everything they can to pin it on Oswald. Lyndon Johnson does not, and he does several actions that correspond with this in the weeks to come, does not want a war with the Soviet Union. Regardless of whatever the motive of any potential conspirators, he recognizes that that is a dangerous proposition, and he ain't going to give them that gift. He's getting a piece of information that's going to make it hard to put together the case that they want. This evidence turns out to be very, very bad. It's going to hurt their ability to make the case. Even more extraordinary is that after these things happened, that's when, after this was revealed, and Hoover called them on it, basically, and the FBI called them on the CIA on their baloney. They started claiming we have no photographs, and started making up stories about the recordings. The little hammer thing, it failed. And I don't know, that maybe the guy was out to lunch when he was supposed to be taking the photos of the front of the
perfect timing, right? Perfect timing.
So it just coincidentally, they can't produce any photographic or audio evidence, even though they were heavily surveilling the building and very, very successful at it. They were hearing every call in and out. They were recording those calls. We even know the name of the woman who was transcribing the calls themselves. Like, this was being done, and they don't have this evidence. And by the way, Johnson made this part of the tape that he was recording in the Oval Office disappear. It's gone. We don't have it. The only reason we have it is that somebody later, as the transcript of it was made before the tape was destroyed. So we have what you just read is off of a transcript. We don't actually have the audio, even though we have thousands and thousands of hours of Johnson talking famously in the Oval Office. My favorite being the time that he ordered some pants.
So why didn't Nixon learn from this?
Yes.
Okay, so you have it. Like, I'm looking at my show notes here, and this is remarkable because you want to make the point that it doesn't matter whether Oswald was in Mexico or not.
So, okay. Dan Hardway, let's return to him now, because that's who we're talking about. That all sets context. You see now that he was the author of a Lopez report that called the CIA basically the bad guys here. They
called the bluff.
They called their bluff. They said, listen, there's a lot of problems with this Mexico City story. So Dan Hardway believes that Oswald, he testified to this, believes that Oswald was in Mexico City. That's his belief today, 62 years after the fact. But he doesn't believe that he was alone necessarily, and he thinks that he likely didn't fully understand how he was being used.
Yeah, why he was there, right?
In other words, he's saying it's a CIA op, just like New Orleans was. These are both intelligence ops, and that's significant. Now, I'm going to full confession, because I don't often talk about all my views here. Maybe you can pick up some of them by implication, but you probably shouldn't assume too much. I'm about 60-40 in favor of the idea that Oswald was not in Mexico. There's a host of problems with even getting him there. He shows up in other places. He has alibis, so to speak. Now, the alibis are not his, but he insists he never went there while he was being interrogated. There's this extraordinary thing where his widow tells government officials investigating the case from various agencies 4 separate times that he didn't make a trip to Mexico. But when she appears in front of the Warren Commission in February 1964 to give the longest testimony of any witness, she not only says he did go to Mexico City, but she begins describing a plot where he was going to hijack a plane, which is a pretty extreme thing. And it's the only person that's told this story is her. And she's a Russian immigrant that doesn't want to be deported. She's very fearful about the mood of the country at the moment. She has a lot of motivations, but one of 2 things is true. Regardless of where you land on any of this, one of 2 things is true about her testimony. Either she was lying 4 times, then told the truth, which is what the Warren Commission believes, or she was telling the truth 4 times and then she lied. And there's a abundant problem with the evidence that gives me kind of 60-40 pause. I'm about 60, maybe even a little bit more, that he didn't go to Mexico City, and maybe about 40%. But Dan Hardway's testimony changed my mind about something. It doesn't matter whether Oswald was in Mexico City or not. What matters is why the CIA cared so much that you, me, everyone listening, the rest of America, what we think about what Oswald was doing there. That's the thing that matters, not his presence. Why they so much want you to understand the story they're telling and about his presence there.
So was Oswald only half right when he said, "I'm a patsy"? Because the other half of that statement would have been, "And so are you," because you're believing what.
Yes,
right?
That's a good point, Bill. I do believe he was a patsy. Me personally. I also don't believe that he's responsible for the shot that killed the president.
Right. I have to agree with you.
We've talked about that in previous episodes,
Yep.
and we're going to get into that with the magic bullet here momentarily.
Yep.
Now, here's what we've covered on why we've covered all this context. This is the punchline of this whole section. We were talking about George Joannides, remember?
Yep.
Why George? Why is George looming over this committee discussion and coming up multiple times? Somebody that most of the American people, even people who watched the JFK movie all the way back in the early 90s, this is a name that's not familiar in this saga. Why is he suddenly so important at this second task force hearing?
So he's the bag man, right? He's running documents back and forth.
Yeah. Hardway ends up sharing a very powerful story. And here's the only commentary I'm going to offer it, because he's going to take nearly 3 minutes. We're going to play the clip for you. He tells this story so well, I didn't think I could do it better. And he lived it. So it's very congruent. But what he says here was so sensational, it should have been headline news. And I think the only reason it wasn't is because there had already been a hearing, and it already had Oliver Stone and Jefferson Morley, and nobody rose to quite that status that was sitting in front of them, even though they had a federal judge in the mix. Nobody rose celebrity-wise to that level. And that's unfortunate, because you were left out of this. But fortunately, because you watch Gracearchy, you listen to Gracearchy, because you can just as easily listen to this, you can hear Dan Hardway describe his interaction of getting information from George Joannides. Let's play this.
My role was a researcher with primary responsibility for researching Lee Harvey Oswald's activities in Mexico City and the CIA response to that.
We've heard about some of the administrative roadblocks that the CIA put up for you. Did you have any direct verbal communication with anybody at the CIA?
Oh, yeah, frequently.
Can you tell us about some of those conversations and how it might have been conceived as obstruction?
Well, when we first started, we had unlimited, unexpurgated access. We had 2 clerks assigned to us. We had our office at the CIA. Pretty much went to work out there every morning. We'd ask for a file. They would go get it. We would review it. It was unredacted and given to us in its original state. After they brought George Joannides in, he began slowly tightening down the process. We were no longer working with 2 clerks who went and got us our files. We had to file formally requests through him to get the files, and we started experiencing significant delays in the files that we would get. We started noticing that the files we would get would have obvious things missing from them. Then he went so far as to actually start putting parts of the files in envelopes and leaving them in the files, so that what we would get is we would sign that we'd seen the files, but we weren't allowed to open the stuff that he had placed in envelopes. That came back to Hanna's later in dealing with the final report and some of the things we were trying to get out of them, when they would tell the chairman of the committee, he's seen that, here's where he signed for the file. And I would have to explain to Chairman Stokes that, no, that was not in the file when I saw it, because that was what I was looking for, and it was not there. It must have been in one of the envelopes. And so he eventually just shut us down. It culminated on one file that I really wanted to see. When it was presented to me, Mr. Joannides showed up himself to give it to me. He was actually bouncing on his toes. Him and Scott Breckenridge brought the file to me at the CIA, called me back out there to see it. It had not just been redacted, it had been retyped with the redactions in white space as it had been retyped. It was a report on a debriefing of a certain person. I exploded. I acted like a very angry 24-year-old and had choice words for both of them, and stormed out of the office and went back to the headquarters. I subsequently, thanks to Judge Tunheim's work, saw the memorandum to the record that Mr. Breckenridge wrote. And the memorandum for the record says that the file was shown to me and, quote, no objections were recorded, close quote. Notice the way you have to watch what the CIA says. He didn't say that I didn't make any, which is what everyone infers from what he said. What he said was none were recorded, and that's because he made the record.
What the hell? I mean, really, Jim, Hardway knew what was happening.
Yeah. I just want to let it stand alone. Let's get to the next point.
I know, right? Okay. Let's talk about the magic bullet. Point 3.
Don Curtis was another witness there. This is a name that's not really known to history. And I got to be honest with you, I had never heard him testify before. I only was aware of his actual occupation. I had heard it mentioned before in people who are on the Warren, who want to continue to drive home the Warren Commission. They want to discredit him because he is an oral surgeon, and they chide him as a mere dentist in the surgical sense. I'm not saying that there's anything mere about being a dentist. I don't want them drilling me because I said that, right? It's not an offense to the class. I'm saying that what is a dentist doing in an emergency operating room? Dr. Don Curtis was at Parkland Hospital that day. He is the second doctor in the room. He is at the time 26 years old and a resident, not a full-fledged practicing doctor yet. He doesn't have a practice. He is a resident at this juncture, 26 years old, working at Parkland Memorial Hospital in the emergency area, and happens to come by and gets a police officer who drags him in. So the way he describes it is Conley was taken out of the limo first and brought in. He had been shot, and Conley's going to live. And so they're doing everything they can to save him. But when they took Kennedy out of the car, the situation is much more grave. He comes out second in the way because he's in the back seat. Conley's kind of in his way. He's in the back seat. They get him in there. There's a lack of doctors and nurses because people had initially, the first wave of them went in to help Conley. And so an officer grabs, according to Dr. Curtis's story, grabs him and shoves him into the room to work with a doctor he already had a very close personal relationship with, and would in the years to come continue to have a close personal relationship, Dr. Carrico. They are the first two doctors in the room with the president. And I think that this guy who was then 26, and now obviously you can do your math, you can add 61 and a half years later onto that. This guy in his late 80s telling the story is coming to defend his class. The context of the discussion that I'm going to share with you here is whether or not the wound that happened to John F. Kennedy's throat was an entrance wound or an exit wound. Without any commentary, I want to say to you that first, no major regime media outlet, CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, none of them have ever said that have ever given equal time or equal place or equal footing, let alone preferential footing, to the idea that that would be an entry wound. Many of them have done exactly opposite and disparaged it as an exit wound. Now, we will put the link to the show that we did in the notes where we talked about the ballistics of this. We got into some of the beginning thing, but it is incredibly important to the magic bullet theory that wound in the president's throat be an exit wound. Now, the situation I just described, where the media was very balanced, or definitely putting their thumb on one side of the scale, has a break in it that occurs on basically the 60th anniversary. Paramount, shortly before the anniversary, that is the company that owns CBS, releases a documentary called The Parkland Doctors. It was based on recorded interviews, and especially a meeting of these doctors where they got together 10 years earlier on approaching the 50th anniversary in 2013. Because by the time 2023 arrived, many of the individuals in that video were deceased. And this is one of the most appalling things about this case, is that time has gone by so that people who can speak have not been able to anymore. We can't hear for them. So this 26-year-old resident has to now show up and be the spokesman for an entire class because he's lived long enough to be at the moment where he gets invited by the U.S. House of Representatives. Yeah. And remember, up until this point, despite the fact that these guys have spoken out publicly and virtually unanimously, with some nuance, which we're not going to get into today, there is nuance to this story, but the summation of the Parkland doctors, if I was going to sum it all up, is none of the doctors believed that this was an exit wound. Now, that's a debatable thing. Like I said, there's nuance to this. You write me and say whatever you want. Maybe someday we'll get into that. But there is a strong case to be made that their true opinion was that it was not an exit wound. And when they reassembled in 2013 to talk amongst each other, none of them said anything to the contrary. One of them, along the way, ends up being basically sanctioned, almost loses his medical license, gets attacked by the Journal of the American Medical Association for basically explaining what Curtis attempts to explain to this committee. And that is that this wound is an entrance wound. Is there an entrance wound here? This is also not an exit wound. The president's kill shot, in his opinion, did not come from behind. He believes, and he's going to explain to you in a moment, that the shot happened roughly right around here. And I want you to look at me right now if you're watching this podcast, okay? As I'm a little off mic, but I want you to look at what I'm doing with my hand. And I'll do this with my hand, okay? You see, for those who are listening and not watching, I'm pointing to an area just behind and above my temple, right by my hairline, which I still think is relatively good for my age. On the right, as I'm doing it, it's on the right side of my head. I don't know what it looks like to you on the screen, but it's the right side of my head. And I want you to, so that's the explanation. I'm pointing to it. Why am I saying this? Well, there's a famous photograph of all these doctors, rows and rows of them, giving descriptions where they're pointing in much the same way to the same spot on their head as the place they believe the entry wound occurred. We could have put that graphic up too, and I didn't think about it until about a half hour before we got in the studio. I wish we had. But they all were saying this. And what was the basis for them saying this? Well, Curtis, actually, he's aged, and it's going to show through in his voice. But for about the next minute, I want you to hear about the moment after they stopped the resuscitation. And Dr. Kemp Clark, who's in the room, who is standing at the head of the president, begins to talk. Here's Dr. Don Curtis's description of that moment.
I should say, for those who are sensitive, this is graphic. So if you have trouble with verbal descriptions, you're going to get them, and they are graphic. You won't see anything visually, though, except Dr. Curtis talking. So here we go.
And picked up the head and stopped the resuscitation. This wound is not compatible with life. you got dead quiet. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody said anything for the longest time. Then he said, okay. And he looked at, by that time, the chiefs of all the surgical services were against the wall across the room from me, and all in white coats, and they had responded to the call that they needed help. And so he said, pointed them out, I need to tell each of you individually what the wound is, so that you can say that later on. And then he described the wound as about a 3 or 4 inch hole in the posterior cranium. And then there's a bullet hole in the right temple. So he described it that the bullet came through the temple into the cranial vault, created a huge pressure in the cranial vault, and when the bullet finally tumbled into the posterior wall, it blew it out. And he explained all that individually to these 5 doctors.
And there's other pieces of evidence that substantiate this claim. The missing autopsy photos that we mentioned from Doug Horne earlier would be helpful in this case. But there's a piece called the Harper fragment, named for the person who found it, which is a piece of the president's skull that was found on the pavement behind the vehicle. Bobby Hargis, who is a Dallas police officer who is riding to the the left rear of the president, gets covered or splattered in blood from the shot, which would seem to indicate a direction coming somewhere from the front. So this is powerful testimony. And for the first time, given that it was in front of a congressional committee, people were being given permission. The American people are finally being given permission to care.
Deep breath. Let's move on. 4th point, witness intimidation.
So Dr. Don, late in the questioning, Don Curtis ends up sharing something that is equally significant. And this is what leads me to believe that he is there defending his class. So the moment you just heard him describe was all the doctors assembled in the room. And you can visualize the way that this goes down, right? Because he goes on to describe where he's standing in the room, and the arrangement of everybody in the room is in the testimony. And I think he's really trying to speak for all of his deceased colleagues at this moment. And he's not stopped, because now that he is given this powerful testimony, he also wants to share a case of witness intimidation that I think is implying, I suspect is implying, happened to he and his colleagues. And there is, if you watch the documentary distributed by Paramount of the Parkland doctors, you will definitely get the impression that this story is congruent with those facts. Now, he takes a long time to share it, and his voice is, hoarse and difficult. So I'm going to share it I'm going to give you my own version of what he shared, hopefully a little quicker than he would have. He's at the hospital. It's 1964. He's been working all day. He's in scrubs, and his hair is a mess, and he's kind of sweaty and dirty from working on his shift. And late in his shift, he gets approached by another person on the staff that says the Warren Commission's in the building, and they would like you to stop down before you leave for the day and talk. So he goes into a room. He gets taken to a room, and in that room with him alone is Arlen Specter, the future senator of the United States, even before that, the future attorney general of the state of Pennsylvania, or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But at this time, he's not elected to anything. He is a counsel, not the lead counsel, a counsel to the Warren Commission. And his role in all of this, which is historically very well documented, is that he is the person who basically invented the magic bullet theory. He begins asking Curtis some biographical questions. He wants to know, hey, who are you, whatever. And he seems to know an awful lot about Curtis. Curtis is actually surprised by how much Specter appears to know about him personally. But the main thing that he notices is that 3 or 4 times, he doesn't remember exactly how many times, he was asked, did you see the exit wound? Now, the president's lying flat on the table, so seeing the exit wound would have been rather difficult if you believe the throat shot and the head shot were entrance wounds. But the throat shot is really what's important here. That's the one they're concerned about at this moment. That's the magic bullet. It needs to exit the throat. And the last time that he asked that question, every time Don Curtis says, no, I never saw an exit wound. He says, every other doctor has suggested that there was an exit wound. So the implication is, are you going to be the only guy that says this? Like, are you going to believe your lying eyes? Right? You start to have this doubt, like, wait, what's wrong with me? Okay.
Oh, wait a minute, Jim, is he talking about, technically Curtis didn't see the back of the president's head where the exit wound was.
Yeah, but we're most focused on the throat now.
So our inspector is creating this illusion that the wound in the throat is an exit wound.
It's coming out. Yep. Not an entrance wound. So Curtis stands by his story. He insists no, despite the fact that he's being told, truthfully or not, that the other doctors had changed their story. That conversation lasts about 20 minutes. He said it might have even been a little bit longer, but it made him feel that he had a reason. He was made to feel. He said, my general impression of how Spector treated me is that I had reason to be in that room because I was there to make the president die. That's how I felt. And he got a little concerned. He got nervous because the next thing that happened, and he had a family, was that Spector invited him to a deposition. It was not optional. He said, we're going into a deposition now. And Curtis said, hey, I'm not ready for this. And Spector says, well, I sent you a letter. And he says, well, I never got it. But the deposition was going to happen right then, right? He's all dirty and disheveled, and Spector's all polished and clean with a nice shoes and suit on. And Spector then says,
he hasn't even been allowed an attorney.
Well, this is what happens next. Spector says, you want a lawyer? And Curtis responds, do I need one? And here's the quote that he shared with the task force. Fella, you're the only one in the room who knows if you need a lawyer.
Yeah.
Now,
can you be any more clear with me?
That's a little bit heavy, right? Remember the exit wound question the Spector was asking?
Sure.
Didn't come up at all in the deposition. He goes in, there's people there, there's a panel. They put him up on a high stool, which is really awkward. They ask questions, but he was never once asked about the exit wound. So we don't have a recording of what happened in that interview between Spector. In fact, there was a significant debate within the Warren Commission on whether or not they had a responsibility to share the contents of the interviews they were having with people with the public, if they needed to record and document those and share those with the commission, and whether or not that needed to be part of the record. And after debate, we know this debate occurred between them. It was early on in the process of the commission's existence. They decided that they were not going to record these interviews. And so Curtis's story isn't substantiated by history, but if you watch the Parkland Doctors by Paramount, you would see that this is congruent with what they experienced. And here, although it isn't getting the headlines it should, we have the second doctor in the room, basically the last one alive, if I'm understanding correctly, telling us, well, this is what it was like when we dealt with the Warren Commission, which, by the way, ultimately he was not called to testify at the Warren before the Warren Commission itself. He was deposed but never testified.
So the witness intimidation process that Spector started actually worked.
Apparently it worked very effectively because there was, as I said, some nuance to this story. There were doctors who began to second guess and question what they believed that day as the historical record emerged. This has to do with the important subject of whether or not you should trust your government. And the answer is simply no. But in 1963, they didn't think that way. In fact,
we had the Cold War. Everything was going. We needed the government.
In fact, this is really a tilting point in American history where people start to question the government. And Vietnam is going to pile on and make that significantly worse.
Oh,
and
right
Watergate's
down through
going to come along.
The worldwide sickness.
And it's going to keep right on going. And
right up until today. I mean, we've got the gilded president, right? So,
and this is where my libertarian view differs a lot from the people who spend their time researching or thinking about this question. There's a lot of Kennedy hagiography. It's a word that's hard for me to pronounce, but they basically put him up on a pedestal and thinking about all the things that he was going to do that were so wonderful in their imagination had he been reelected in 1964. And whether those things are true or not, he's still a man with flaws who is not perfect and did some things that are pretty bad, actually. And he actually was, he and his brother were interested, for example, in assassinating Castro. That happened.
Yep.
So a more honest assessment of these things includes the ability, like this is what they do. The reason I bring this up is they go, well, we need to restore trust in government. We need to get the truth out and show that the government is capable of telling the truth. Well, no, we need to get the truth out so that people actually understand how bad people lie in the current moment to, at a minimum, cover their own rear ends, and maximally to do a lot of purposeful destruction.
What is it? What's the takeaway on this whole thing from government?
I think you've basically nailed what the takeaway is. I think you need to basically be informed of what your government does. I think you need to know and understand how it really works. And I do not think they deserve, like Robert Blakey, I don't think that, not just the CIA, the entire state apparatus has sought to keep these secrets for so long. Let's assume that all of it was innocent. They still went to great lengths to hide these facts from you. That alone, as it's emerging, is incredibly telling about why the state, why the political class deserves the penalty of the doubt.